One paycheck away is not a metaphor, but a measurable economic condition affecting millions of Americans. When households have little to no savings, even a minor income shock can push them into homelessness. In economic terms, this reflects a lack of financial resilience caused by stagnant wages and rising living costs. When expenses consistently grow faster than income, the margin for error disappears. A single medical bill, job loss, or rent increase can collapse a household budget overnight. Without savings or access to affordable credit, eviction becomes almost inevitable. Homelessness is often framed as an individual failure, but economic data shows it is usually a systemic one. Most people experiencing homelessness were housed just weeks or months earlier. Once on the street, the costs multiply rather than disappear. Transportation, food access, healthcare, and employment become more expensive and less accessible. This creates a negative feedback loop where homelessness itself makes re-entry into the labor and housing market harder. Economically, it is far cheaper to prevent homelessness than to manage its long-term consequences. The emotional toll is visible, but the underlying driver is structural vulnerability. When an economy leaves large portions of its workforce one shock away from collapse, homelessness becomes a predictable outcome. Homelessness is rising nationwide, and the data confirms it is not isolated to a few major cities. Increases are being recorded across urban, suburban, and even rural areas. Economically, this trend aligns closely with housing supply shortages. When demand for housing outpaces construction, prices rise and lower-income households are pushed out first. Rent has increased far faster than wages over the past decade. This widening gap means workers can be fully employed and still unable to afford stable housing. The demographics of homelessness are also changing. Multi-familia seniors and full-time workers are now represented in the data. This shift indicates that homelessness is less about unemployment and more about affordability. Jobs alone are no longer a guaranteed path to housing security. The acceleration of homelessness is tied to inflation, interest rates, and reduced public housing investment. Higher borrowing costs slow new construction, tightening supply even further. Evictions rise as landlords respond to market pressures, not personal circumstances. From an economic perspective, homelessness is the visible outcome of systemic imbalance. When basic housing costs exceed what labor markets can support, displacement becomes unavoidable. The numbers are not just statistics. They are indicators of structural failure. The rise in homelessness didn't happen overnight. It is the result of decades of structural economic shifts. Housing costs have outpaced wage growth for most American workers, creating a persistent affordability gap. Stagnant incomes mean that even full-time employment often fails to cover basic living expenses. The cost of renting or buying a home has increased faster than productivity gains in the labor market. Policy gaps have worsened the situation. Federal, state, and local housing programs have not expanded quickly enough to meet the growing demand for affordable units. Additionally, zoning restrictions and limited construction in many urban areas have constrained supply. This has pushed prices up and concentrated scarcity in regions with high employment opportunities. The economic principle of supply and demand explains much of the problem. When supply is tight and demand remains high, prices inevitably rise, and low-income households are disproportionately affected. Public investment in safety nets like mental health, addiction services, and emergency housing has not kept pace with need. Without these supports, short-term economic shocks translate quickly into long-term homelessness. Ultimately, the crisis reflects systemic imbalance rather than personal failure. Understanding the economic forces at work helps explain why homelessness continues to grow despite overall wealth in the country. Life on the streets is not just a social tragedy, it is an economic burden on both individuals and communities. Daily survival requires significant informal expenditures on food, transportation, and shelter alternatives. Shelter shortages exacerbate these costs. Overcrowded facilities cannot meet demand, forcing people to spend money on temporary solutions or to remain on. The lack of stable housing reduces labor market participation. Many unhoused individuals face difficulties maintaining regular employment, creating a cycle of income instability. Street homelessness also imposes costs on cities, from emergency medical care to policing and sanitation. Economically, society bears the burden of unaddressed housing insecurity. Voices of the unhoused illustrate how these costs accumulate. Health problems, legal fines, and lack of access to social services increase vulnerability and decrease the chance of re-entry into the housing market. Economists refer to this as a negative feedback loop. Without intervention, the personal and public costs multiply, reinforcing systemic inefficiency. Addressing homelessness efficiently requires understanding the economics of scarcity and market failure. Providing stable housing reduces both human suffering and long-term societal costs. If current trends continue, homelessness in America is likely to rise further. Economic pressures, such as high housing costs, inflation, and income inequality, are expected to intensify. Those most at risk include working families, seniors, and low-wage earners. Even full-time employment is no longer a guaranteed path to housing stability in many regions. The impact extends beyond individuals. Cities face increasing costs for emergency services, healthcare, and law enforcement as homelessness rises. From a macroeconomic perspective, widespread housing instability reduces labor market efficiency. People without stable homes struggle to maintain consistent employment, lowering productivity and overall economic output. Experts warn that without policy intervention, the negative feedback loops will deepen. Short-term solutions, like temporary shelters, address symptoms but not the structural causes. Long-term strategies require expanding affordable housing, increasing wage growth, and strengthening social safety nets. Economically, preventative measures are far cheaper than reactive solutions.